Guess who gave Kim Penders 100 of their dollars? It's me, because I refuse to learn from my past experiences. If you didn't know, based on the apparent financial success of the Laura Sue Chronicles Beginnings, which if you remember was basically just a reprint of Ken's light Mobius stories, with a few new ones tagged onto the end, Ken decided to release the Knuckles Omnibus, a remastered collection of his Knuckles-centric stories from the Archie Sonic comics. The back of this collected edition even features some reviews, one by Dan Drazen, a reviewer who's been covering the Archie Sonic comics since 1995, and also Knuckles87, a writer for Sonic Stadium. Sorry, it caught me off guard to see a review credited to a username next to one credited to a normal name. Not that I have a lot of room to talk since most people know me as Squid, but I do agree with the sentiments of this review. I like the Archie Sonic comics in part because they're weird. Despite what it being called an omnibus may suggest, this doesn't collect the entirety of the Knuckles solo series. In fact, it only covers up to issue 6. This is partly because he's already planning a second volume of the omnibus as part of his Mobian Adventure series line, though in complete fairness, it does still cover the material from the Knuckles-centric stories that preceded his solo series. So there's about 440 pages in here covering content from 22 issues. And it's also not unheard of to have multiple volumes of an omnibus covering the same character. All this being said, I do need to talk about the price point and if the amount of content is worth it. With shipping, this did run me about $125, but I don't think it's fair to include the shipping, so we'll say about $100. Without the shipping, the Laura Sue Chronicles Beginnings cost me about $36. I would compare that book to IDW's Sonic the Hedgehog 30th Anniversary book, which costs about $20. That is definitely an increase in price, but independently published material, for reasons we'll discuss later, normally costs a little more. Overall, they both are hardcover with a similar amount of pages of good print quality. I think the price of the Laura Sue Chronicles Beginnings is fair, even if I think I may be entitled to compensation. With a title like Ken Penders' Knuckles Omnibus, the natural reaction is to compare it to the Marvel omnibuses. Omnibuy. I don't know. But I do think that's a fair comparison. Both are at a similar price point, and both are hardcover collected editions with a dust cover, with the art being touched up in some way. That being said, the difference is the amount of pages. The Marvel omnibuses are usually over 1,000 pages each, and as I said before, the Knuckles omnibus is only 440 pages. The pricing becomes even more egregious if you compare it to something like the Spawn Compendium, which, while not being a hardcover, is only $60 and is also over 1,000 pages. While I'm tempted to be hard on Ken for this difference in pricing, the fact is I'm familiar with the industry and know the exact reason why it's priced like this. Marvel is of course one of the big two in the comic space, and while Image is considered indie, it's still home to some of the most popular comic book characters ever. When you have books printed, it's generally cheaper per unit the more copies you are getting printed. For instance, while I'm spending more overall per book, it's cheaper to get 1,000 copies of something than it is to get 100. Because of both the size of the companies and the recognizable natures of their IPs, it's pretty safe for both Marvel and Image to print large amounts of these books at the same time. Ken is one person and is not backed by a large publisher. He just tweeted about how he and his wife were the ones packing up these books to get shipped. I also don't think Ken misunderstands how he's viewed in the Sonic fandom. I think he's well aware a good portion of the community will not touch this based solely on his involvement, so he cannot safely produce a gross amount of books. Also, when tariffs threatened to make his books even more expensive, he refused to raise the price. I think $100 plus $25 shipping is more than likely a fair price based on how much he was paying per unit. But with all that being said, should we, as the consumer, care? That's a tough question, again because I know how the industry works and I'm passionate about comics. I'm empathetic to what Ken is dealing with. But there still exists the value judgment of, is the experience of this worth the amount of money for it? Like, I also know making video games is hard, but I'm not going to spend $80 if I don't think I personally am going to get $80 worth of fun, Nintendo. Sorry, that slipped out. I can't provide an objective answer because both, again, I'm deeply invested in comics as a medium, and everyone's experience may vary. But I'm hoping this video helps you all come to your own conclusions. The book opens with a foreword written by Dan Drazen. Even though I never read his reviews as they were coming out, I did feel a certain kinship with him as I read this. Despite the large gap of time between our entrances into this fandom, I find we're very similar, having a preference for SatAM over Adventures, though I've definitely come around on Adventures' cartoonier style as I've gotten older, and knowing that while the comics could be pretty bad sometimes, we were both still enamored with them all the same. He even talks about the comics being his gateway into writing fanfiction, which I too have experimented with. Never really posted any, they mostly stay in my drafts, but I do read a bit. I know when the terms Sonic and fanfic are brought up online, some members of the fandom get a feeling of repulsion. But when you look at the staff over at IDW, the majority, if not all of the writing team, have engaged in some form of fanfic. Hell, in an AMA, Ian Flynn actually encouraged it to hone your craft as a writer. I never thought I'd actually praise a foreword to a book, but I really felt something reading it. I genuinely think had I come into contact with Drazen's writing growing up, it definitely would have influenced my own style. Also, I gotta give Ken some props for being willing to include a foreword that blatantly says, "Yeah, the comic sucks sometimes." Next is Ken's own introduction. This is about 9 pages long, so I won't cover everything, but there's some interesting stuff in here. Like Sega initially demanded that This Island Hedgehog, the story that introduced Knuckles to the Archie Sonic comics, be removed from the issue before it was published, and only allowed it to go forward when editor Scott Fulop told them they'd have to pay all costs relating to pulling and replacing the story. Ken covers a lot of background info that's pretty interesting, and I'm sure I'll end up citing this in future videos. He almost clears up the Knuckles and Julie Sue being kinda related thing, and then immediately doubles down on it the exact same way he defended his Sally and Jeffrey tweet, "Ken!" I also thought everyone would enjoy the sentence. The truth was I was more confident in my abilities as an artist than as a writer, which says so much. With all that out of the way, let's talk about the core material of this book. Now, I'm not going to be going over the stories in here, as there's nothing really new. These are the same stories that saw print as early as 1994. But what I can talk about is how the remastering was handled. How comics are reprinted is actually a huge source of discourse in comics fandom, as there's no shortage of arguments on how material is represented, and if it's true to the original artistic intent. I even have a reprint of a series that just elected to print the highest quality scans available with no touch-ups. It is unreadable at times, but it is a way to preserve the book in its original state. This isn't even a new source of contention within the Sonic fandom, as Archie's own reprints made a ton of changes to the original coloring, which, in all honesty, does make the artwork look a lot worse. Like, art from this time period of Archie Sonic is undoubtedly rough, but the choice to not only haphazardly change the colors of background characters, but also shade artwork that was originally presented in flats, looks bad. Things were also brightened a little too much, killing the intended mood of a lot of panels. There's tons of examples of pages that look fine in the initial release, but are abysmal in the re-release. So naturally, with Ken doing his own release, you'd think there would be an effort to preserve the comics in their original state. But well, This Island Hedgehog from Sonic the Hedgehog number 13, both Knuckles' first appearance in the Archie Sonic comics and the lead story in this omnibus, is almost completely redrawn and recolored. The colors are redone to be closer to the games. I did see some people claiming that the colors were directly color-picked from IDW's classic Sonic comics. There's no proof for that claim, but there is a resemblance, and it definitely no longer resembles the original release. Tails is redrawn in every panel, again looking closer to the games than his SatAM counterpart, and pretty much every other panel has been touched up at least a little bit. Some visual gags have even been removed. A small change that bugged me specifically that's present throughout a large portion of the book is that they gave Robotnik a pink nose. This is accurate to Ivo Eggman Robotnik, however, this iteration of Robotnik was based on Julian Robotnik from SatAM, who did not have a pink nose. It's just sort of a weird choice, knowing that this is not the character that becomes Eggman. I'm of two minds on this. On one hand, I think a re-release is supposed to preserve the original comic. not just the stories, but the artistic intent. So I do think it's a little disrespectful to just redraw Dave Manick's artwork. You're George Lucasing it a little bit. These comics in their original form are going to become harder and harder to find as time goes on, and I think this is missing out on a genuine chance to pass down a bit of comic history. However, despite the fact that I find the decision to redraw the entire story a baffling one, it does look good. Yeah, I do have to admit a good portion of the issues I take with the redraw are ideological. I know a lot of people whose entire barrier to entry into reading the early Archie Sonic comics was the artwork, so I could imagine some people giving the stories a chance based on these changes. Again, I don't think it's good to do this when access to the original version is more limited, but in a vacuum, I do think it looks good, and it would be disingenuous of me to pretend otherwise. I also need to say this Island Hedgehog is the only story that's completely redrawn. Of the 26 stories collected in this omnibus, only 9, not including the opening story, are given this new updated coloring, and only 6 of those have any adjustments done to the art. Tails is redrawn, eyes and expressions are redrawn, some weird color choices I noticed. The Freedom Fighters, but Antoine especially, are given color palettes closer to their post-reboot counterparts. Sonic's given brown eyes, which confuses me, but then I remember there's a whole story about how Sonic's eyes turned green. So I get it, they could still just be black though. But besides that, the majority of the art is untouched. 13 of these stories are closer to being true restorations of the original artwork. And as someone who didn't exist when some of these stories came out and experienced them through Archie's reprints, I do have a newfound appreciation for the original artwork. When colored properly, it's pretty cool to look at. I have already mentioned that Ken is planning a second omnibus as well as a few other books, and this is what I want to see in those. Archie Sonic didn't dodge cancellation for 24 years on a fluke. Even in its more questionable moments, people were continuing to read it, and I think preserving the comic as close to how it was printed as possible helps people understand why. I'm not sure if Ken always planned for these stories to look like this, or if they were going to get the new colorization until he got pushback on Twitter when he first previewed the colors. If it's the latter, I gotta give him credit for taking the critiques seriously, even though some people were being very rude about it. But if it's the former, that just makes the recolored portions all the more baffling. The other 3 stories, all from the Knuckles Chaotix special, are almost identical to Archie's own reprint from Sonic Select number 2, though the colors are a little duller. I don't know what the reason for this is. The rest of the book is very committed to doing something different with the artwork compared to what Archie did. Another thing that's clearly different about this is that Sonic is the darker blue he was in the original printing. Just an odd change. It's weird to say, but Ken didn't do a bad job with this. But I guess I should have expected that. From my Lara Sue Chronicles review, I was happy with the reprinted portion aside from a handful of odd changes. Here, more than half of the book is a faithful remastering of the original comic as released. The recolored portions, despite me taking some objections to, doesn't look bad. Honestly, the weakest part is the 3 stories that were left unchanged from Archie's own reprinting. I felt I got something out of the foreword and introduction. Also, this is kinda standard in an omnibus, but some initial sketches of covers and pages are included, which I always like to see. Ken also included a section of bios of other creators who worked on some of the material in here, and thanks them openly in his acknowledgement. Ken's next project is Scott Shaw's Sonic Days, a collection of all the Sonic stories worked on by Scott Shaw, including the initial miniseries that launched the Archie Sonic comics. This is being done in collaboration with Scott, so Ken has been very clear that Shaw will be getting paid. I will probably pick it up, despite the fact that from Ken's preview, it looks like it's going to be the new coloring style. Though thankfully it doesn't look like any line work has been altered. Doing that would completely undermine the fact that this is a book collecting Shaw's artwork, and I'll probably make a video when it comes out. From the last page of the Knuckles Omnibus, it says that book should have been available for pre-order last month, but the URL provided doesn't work, and Ken hasn't posted about it. So they might just be running behind and might not hit that Christmas 2025 release date. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm sure it was expected for me to be meaner to Ken in this video, but I gotta be honest if I end up liking something. I want to thank my patrons and give a special shout out to my $5 patrons, Ned Rex, Nate DM990, Diddly Do, and Queer Kaiju. See y'all in the next video.